Manifest destiny ain't had a rest ever since Horace Greeley said, young man, go west. So we've chewed up the mountains and spit out the plains while we get indigestion with each acid rain. It's gotten so bad the West ain't any place. I'll ask you, how are you? And you stare into space. What's left of the West where we've already been? So I'll ask you, why?
Welcome, it's so good to see everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is really exciting to see everyone here tonight. My name is Patty Ames, and I'm the president of the Flathead-Lolo-Bitterroot Citizen Task Force. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we are here on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Callisto people. We express our gratitude and honor the enduring relationship these Indigenous communities have with their lands, and we pay our respect to the elders past and present. From my view up here, I see many people who have been fighting for many decades to protect the last fragments of our roadless lands and beyond. The wild places, the wildlife, the cold Clearwater fisheries, the old-growth forests. I also see many younger people who are passionate about protecting these places that are threatened, which are essential for our souls and for the future of living beings on this earth. Seeing all of us together here this evening reminds me how much we need to come together, keep each other informed and inspired so that we can keep fighting. A number of stalwart activist conservation organizations came together to sponsor this event because, as you know, the roadless rule is about to be rescinded, and we know that we need grassroots activism to thwart that disastrous plan. As we will hear tonight, we must fight for more protection, not just low-level status quo that we have thus far settled for. We have maps on the TV screens, and individual comments do matter. The number of comments can influence the decision makers. Protect this injustice. Write your comments, no matter how simple, be part of history. We have a stellar lineup of presenters that will describe the history of roadless land protection, the current state of roadless rules, and why it matters that we continue to fight. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to quote one of my favorite authors and conservation activist, Rebecca Solnit. I believe in hope as an act of defiance, or rather as the foundation for an ongoing series of acts of defiance. Those acts necessary to bring about some of what we hope for while we live by principle in the meantime. There is no alternative except surrender, and surrender not only abandons the future, it abandons our soul. The first speaker is Shelly Fyant. She is a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She resides in the Jocko Valley of the Flathead Indian Reservation. From 2014 to 2021, she served on the Tribal Council of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes.
Good evening, everyone. Kihio Estrio Luis West. My Indian name is Eagle Woman, and my English name is Shelly Fyant. I'm very thankful to be here today. Much to the organizers for the opportunity to speak and bring an Indigenous woman's perspective to this subject. So many things have changed in my lifetime and in our world during my short time on Earth that it really is an honor to be invited to share just a tiny piece of our history and ideology. To set the stage, I want to share with you all the Salish word for human beings, or the people. And that word is Skelly Skelly. That comes from two words. The first is the meaning for, or is the word for meat or flesh, which is skelcht. And the second is the word for land, which is studli. So the meaning, the background of the word for the people is flesh from the land, flesh from the earth. So we as Salish are flesh from the land, and that creates a responsibility to care for the land. We have a reciprocal relationship with all other living things. And I want to read something that came from one of the Salish Kalispa Culture Committee writings, and it pretty much sums up our ideology. At the center of tribal cultures lay a deeply ingrained ethic of reciprocity between people and between people and the land. We live by a shared sense of what is appropriate and right in our relations with each other and with the earth. In one of our creation stories, when the animals were preparing the earth for the coming of the human beings, they had a gathering to talk about how the world around them would change and what their future roles would be. The Kwikwai, or buffalo, said, "I will be meat for my Salish." The moose, elk, deer, fish, birds, plant medicines, plant foods, they all expressed what their roles would be in this new world when the humans came. It was decided that the humans would be the ones to speak. With that came the responsibility to speak for those who can't in today's world. So I want to tell you a brief story about how the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes Mission Mountain Wilderness came to be. One of the first actions that CSKT Tribal Council wanted to do was designate the missions and our land as a national park. Well, the Department of Interior in the 1930s denied that. Then this fellow named Bob Marshall came along, and he recognized the Mission Range as a prime piece of real estate, and he recommended a roadless designation. Later, the tribes requested the Mission Range be taken off of that. We wanted to manage it ourselves in the name of tribal sovereignty, and that was in the late 50s. So fast forward to the 70s, keeping in mind that the tribe's main source of economy was timber. Our foresters recommended the Mission Mountain foothills for a timber sale, and it was proposed in the Ashley Creek drainage. So there was these three ayahs, these three grandmothers who opposed that. They went about and they got 12 to 1,300 names on petitions. And they went to the tribal council and asked the tribal council to not to go ahead with the Ashley Creek timber sale. And the council heard their plea and said, "Okay, thank you." And those three ayahs just stood there. And they said, "Okay, we heard you, you can go now." And they refused. They said, "No, we'll stay until you take action." And so they took the vote right then and there. And their reasoning was, that the tribal wilderness it's really a place of sustenance. It's a whole ecosystem that we need to keep intact. So in that regard, waters don't recognize boundaries. Grizzly bears and wolves and eagles, they don't recognize the boundary between, the Forest Service and the tribal wilderness. And insects and diseases don't recognize those boundaries as well unless they're treated differently. Those healthy, intact ecosystems are necessary for healthy economies. And believe me when I tell you that our subsistence economy is alive and well today. My freezer is mostly full of bison, elk, and berries. My ancestors before me lived entirely on those foods. My great-great-grandma, who lived in the Bitterroot, lived to be 112. My great-grandma lived to be in her 80s. My grandma lived to be 59. My dad lived to be 50. So some of that was due to the foods that we ate. When we think about what the current administration has proposed as to why we need roads, they're saying we need it for fire suppression. If you go back to the tribal way of living with the land, we need fire on the land. It's our policy in our wilderness to let it burn, unless there's a danger for homes in the buffer zone. So if you've seen some of these fires, they're beautiful. They create this mosaic and they get rid of, the red and dead and everything that needs to go. So the last thing I want to close with is a short story that a friend of mine, Ray Big Crane, and I don't know if any of you know him, but he was kind of the voice of CSKT in a lot of our films. Roy shared a story with me that he was up in the missions going for a vision quest, and that's pretty common for men or young men of that age. And he was there for a few days, fasting, praying, looking for this spiritual direction. And all of a sudden a hang glider came and landed in the spot where he was. And you could just feel the heartbreak and sadness years later when he was telling me this story about how that just ruined everything for him. And I hadn't thought about this until I was, thinking about the wilderness and why we need to protect it besides our food and our spiritual sustenance. But I was reminded of this story, and that's why it reminds me of why we need to protect these sacred places. So, thank you.
Here we are again. I thought we had this turkey roasted in the year 2000, but like so many conservation victories, we have to defend what we've won over and over and over again, and that's just the way it is, and this is a perfect example. I was asked to talk about the history of the National Forest Roadless Area issue, and I guess you could start with Aldo Leopold in 1924, who was a biologist for the Forest Service, and he convinced his superiors in the agency to set aside over 500,000 acres of wild country in the headwaters of the Gila Wilderness in southwestern New Mexico as the nation's first wilderness area. But of course, this was 40 years before the Wilderness Act was passed, so the Gila Wilderness was an administrative designation that could be administratively designated by one bureaucrat, but administratively undesignated by the next bureaucrat who took over. And that's exactly what happened. A few years after the Gila was designated wilderness in 1924, the Forest Service declassified a corridor through the heart of the Gila Wilderness so they could build a road that's called the North Star Road. And it was built primarily to help out livestock operators, but we learned a lesson. You can't trust the Forest Service to maintain protections even when they're the initiators of such protections. To put the roadless area issue into perspective, you have to realize that from the 1940s into the 1990s, the U.S. Forest Service was presiding over, and I don't use this term lightly, a full-scale ecological holocaust with thousands of miles of new roads being bulldozed into erstwhile roadless areas every year on an annual basis. As a matter of fact, many people were wondering how much roadless land was being lost. And in the early 1980s, then Forest Service Chief Maxwell Peterson, he let the cat out of the bag by admitting that we probably rode and developed about 1 million acres of roadless lands every year. through the Forest Service road building and clear cutting program. That's an area almost half the size of Yellowstone National Park, of wild country that was going into the multiple use paradigm for intensive development every year. Multiple use was a bad idea when it first surfaced in the 1940s and 1950s. It was a bad idea when Congress enacted the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960. Excuse the French, but bullshit on multiple use. It's a bad idea then, it's a bad idea now, and public lands should be treated as nature reserves, not multiple abuses. Fortunately, a few years after Aldo Leopold left the Forest Service, a fellow named Bob Marshall, who most of you are familiar with, became the head of recreation for the entire United States Forest Service. And Bob decided that we needed more wilderness areas in the National Forest System, so he actually succeeded in convincing some of his superiors to begin setting aside additional areas on top of the original Gila wilderness. Forest Service went along with Bob for a while, but unfortunately, he died in 1939, I think at the age of 39, much too young, and after Bob Marshall left, the Forest Service greatly pared back their efforts at setting aside areas as wilderness and primitive areas. Shortly after Bob Marshall died, the United States entered World War II, and after the war was over, there was a housing boom with a greatly increased demand for wood, and the Forest Service wanted its piece of the pie. In 1952, Assistant Forest Service Chief Christopher Granger was quoted as saying the uptick in logging was due to the Forest Service men, not women, going out and getting the business. Well, think about it. What does that mean? It means that the Forest Service actually solicited the timber industry to set up shop with lumber mills in and around small rural communities all across the western United States. And this, of course, created the intensely vitriolic controversies between proponents for wilderness and maintaining roadless areas and those who were determined to get their chainsaws into these backcountry stands of forest. Make no mistake, the roadless area versus logging issue was set up by the Forest Service with the intention and with the promise to the timber industry of unending supplies of timber. And I think now we all know how unrealistic that is. During this road building binge that the Forest Service was on from the 40s to the 90s, we ended up with a road system in the national forests of, I've read anywhere from 350 to 430,000 miles, but the figure that seems to be most in use says that there's 380,000 miles of bulldozed roads crisscrossing and fragmenting the national forest system, and that doesn't even include state, county, or federal rights-of-way. According to the Forest Service's website, about 265,000 acres of this road mileage are actually being maintained for passenger car travel. But what's so bad about roads? We're here because we want to keep roadless area roadless, but everybody uses roads. We all drive on them. We all like to take a Sunday drive to the nearest trailhead, drive to the nearest liquor store, whatever the case may be, drive to prison to visit all your friends. But the fact that there's millions of miles of roads crisscrossing our continent comes with some severe ecological costs. Roads create habitat fragmentation, which results in the extirpation of populations of wilderness-dependent species like grizzly bears, lynx, wolverines. They create weed infestation along their bulldozed edges. They create avenues for poaching, for littering. And if you're worried about wildfires, worry about the rodent matrix more than roadless areas, because it's the rodent matrix of the National Forest System that is most susceptible to both severe fires and to the multiplicity of ignitions. Roads completely changed the character of natural landscapes into something that wild nature never evolved with. The post-World War II orgy of road building and logging and mining and oil exploration and all of the other so-called multiple uses eventually led to the movement to create a Wilderness Act, which, as most of you know, became law on September 3rd, 1964. It was written primarily by Howard Zonheiser, then the executive director of the Wilderness Society. And the Wilderness Act is a brilliant piece of legislation. I mean, among other phrases that it uses, it defines wilderness as being a landscape of public lands, at least 5,000 acres in size, that is untrammeled, which means uncontrolled, unregulated, unconfined. It further defines wilderness as being an area in which the imprint of humanity's work was substantially unnoticeable. And that's an important phrase, because oftentimes we hear people saying that this can't be wilderness because it's not completely pristine. Well, the Wilderness Act doesn't require completely pristine. Let's face it, no place on earth is completely pristine nowadays, but it uses the term substantially unnoticeable because when you're in a wilderness, you know it. When you're in the Yellowstone backcountry watching a wolf take down a bull elk during October, you know it. You know you're in a wild place. And that should be our ultimate goal, legal wilderness designation by Congress under the Wilderness Act of 1964. The public demanded more areas to be protected, and in the early 1970s, the Forest Service decided to do a national inventory of its remaining roadless areas. That's called the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation, now known as RARE 1. Well, guess what? They were supposed to inventory all of the roadless areas within the National Forest domain, but unfortunately, the Forest Service, I know this will come as a shock to many of you, did a shabby job. In fact, they conveniently excluded areas from their inventory that had potential timber sales within them. It got real complicated. There were lawsuits. One of them was Sierra Club versus Butts. And the upshot of it was in 1977, when Jimmy Carter was president, the Forest Service decided that we'll have a do-over on the roadless area inventory. So they did it over again. That's called RARE 2. Again, the Forest Service conveniently excluded roadless areas that had potential timber sales. And also there were many roadless areas that had already gone through a land use planning process. So the Forest Service decided they didn't have to include it in the inventory. And for some reason, the conservation movement, led by a small cadre of Washington, D.C. Conservationists in the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society, decided on a strategy in which the conservation movement would recommend only a small portion of the available roadless areas for ultimate wilderness designation. Meanwhile, the timber, mining, oil and gas, off-road vehicle industries said no more wilderness. We don't want any wilderness. And what did the Forest Service do? They went about halfway in between the two proposals and recommended only 15 million acres out of that vast roadless domain for wilderness designation. After RARE 2, the road building and clear cutting binge continued, and I consider RARE 2 to be the grandiose defeat of modern conservation. Some of you know me as a co-founder of the original EarthFirst. That's for the original EarthFirst. I take no credit for the entity that's out there now going by the same name. But the reality of the original founding of EarthFirst was that it was a reaction to the way the conservation movement rolled over and played dead in Rare 2. When Mike Dombeck became the chief of the Forest Service under Bill Clinton in the late 1990s, he looked at the amount of roads infesting the National Forest System and said, we can't even maintain half of this road mileage. Why should we be building new roads? And he instituted a moratorium on road building in the National Forest that morphed into the roadless rule that we're still trying to defend 26 years later. We not only need to defend the roadless rule, we need to demand that it be strengthened as well. We need to make sure that the roadless rule bans mechanized off-road travel, disallows new structures such as lodges or camping shelters in designated wilderness, and we also need to demand that the Forest Service inventories the rest of its roadless domain so that all roadless areas over 5,000 acres get the same level of protection. Rolling over and playing dead didn't work in the past, it doesn't work now. We need to demand from the Forest Service a full and comprehensive approach to roadless areas, and we need to treat not just the National Forest, but all public lands as nature reserves, not just repositories for making money. Thank you.
This speech I'm going to give is kind of oriented towards younger folks, so if it does not resonate, just bear with me. All right. Think about how most of us start and end our day. We wake up, sometimes before we even get out of bed, we reach for our phones. We scroll through headlines, posts, videos, bits and pieces of the world coming at us faster than we can really process them. We breeze past articles about climate change, division, foreign policy nightmares, disappearing wildlife, polluted rivers. It's constant and it's overwhelming. We're told the world is falling apart, but we're rarely shown how to fix even a piece of it. So we go about our day with a lingering anxiety of things to come, and at night we repeat the same ritual. And after a while, the stories and causes we hear about don't motivate us. They do the opposite. They make us feel like nothing we do will matter, and a numbness and apathy set in. But here's the thing. Most people aren't apathetic because they don't care. They're apathetic because they don't know where to start. When the problems feel global, massive, and urgent all at once, it's easy to feel small. And when you feel small, doing nothing starts to feel reasonable. So we scroll, we watch, we absorb, and slowly we disconnect. But in my work, I get to see something different. I've had the pleasure of guiding people outdoors throughout the West, and people from every walk of life and background. And a lot of people show up carrying that same weight. They're distracted, overwhelmed, unsure how they fit into any of it. But something changes. Once I was taking a group on a backpacking trip along the thoroughfare in Yellowstone National Park. There were 8 of us, including a guy around my age who came there by himself. First couple of days of the trip, this guy was plugged in the whole time. He was headphones on, blasting podcasts, listening to music, just did not pay attention to anything. But on the 3rd night, we were sitting around camp talking about what we'd seen the last few days, and he noticed this big white rock near the campfire, and he asked what it was. I told him it was a piece of petrified wood, and it was much, much older than the Yellowstone supervolcano we know about today. It was from an ancient forest, older than the Rocky Mountains. dates back to about 50 million years ago when the Absaroka volcanic supergroup lined that whole area for thousands of square miles. I could see the gears starting to spin in his mind. The awe of deep time just swept over him. He asked more questions about the rocks, the trees, the plants, and animals. He started paying more attention to his surroundings, and eventually he put his headphones away. Conversations with him and the group got more personal, and real connections were formed. He started the trip alone among 7 other strangers, but since then, he's gone on 2 other trips with members of that same first group and has gotten involved with conservation groups in his home state. He found his connection, his community, and his reason to care. Now I'd like to shift the focus to our own backyard on the Blackfoot River. Just about everybody knows the Blackfoot was portrayed famously and a river runs through it. But some of you may not know that when Robert Redford was choosing filming locations, he decided to not film on the Blackfoot because of its poor condition. Those who know the river today are often astounded by that fact. Over the last few years, I've taken people along the Blackfoot to tell the story of what it used to be, polluted from logging and mining, degraded and written off. But then they learned what happened next. Communities came together, people showed up. They restored habitat, improved water quality, and made long-term commitments. And today, it's one of the clearest examples we have of a whole ecosystem coming back to life. You can actually see it. You can stand there and look at something that was broken and is now functioning again. You see the cranes and swans returning, the beavers reclaiming their wetlands, the deer and elk grazing the mountains and valleys, and the bears, mountain lions, and wolves coming back from the brink of extirpation. And in that moment, people don't feel overwhelmed. They feel something else. They feel connected. And that's the shift. People don't take action because of information. We have more information than ever. People take action because of connection. When something becomes real, when it's not just a headline, but a place you've stood, a story you've heard, something you've experienced, that's when it starts to matter. And without that sense of place, that sense of belonging, it's really hard to care in a meaningful, sustained way. So if the problem is disconnection, the solution is actually pretty simple. It's not easy, but simple. It starts with 3 things. First, get close to something real. Not everything, just something. A river, a trail, a local issue, a place you return to. Care starts with proximity. Second, talk to people. Not comments, not arguments online, actual conversations. Most real change has always started with people sitting down and figuring things out together. Third, start small. You don't have to fix everything. You just have to participate in something. Small actions aren't insignificant. They're how momentum begins. And it's worth saying this clearly. Apathy isn't laziness. It's often exhaustion. It's the result of caring about too many things from too far away. So the answer isn't to care more about everything, it's to care more deeply about something. Because when you do that, when you connect to a place or a community or a story, you start to see something that's easy to miss from a distance, that not everything is falling apart. There are things being rebuilt, restored, and protected every single day. But most of that work doesn't happen at a global scale. It happens locally, it happens quietly, and it happens because people decided to show up. We're told the world is falling apart, but the truth is, there are pieces of it being put back together all the time. And most of the time, it doesn't start with a big movement. It starts with someone paying attention, someone getting involved, someone deciding to care about a small piece of the world right in front of them. Because the opposite of apathy isn't passion, it's participation. Thank you for your time.
Thanks to the organizers for the invitation to speak. This is a picture of roadless areas in the west, the inventoried roadless. This is a superimposition of the disturbance-dependent mixed conifer forests in the west. And by disturbance-dependent, I mean they've got to be disturbed, basically. And roadless area is going to be very important for maintaining a disturbance-dependent system. Now, in order to talk about this in detail, I've got to introduce fire. Now, you've all heard the story. If you haven't heard the story, you live under a rock. There's good fire, which is on the left there with the burning the understory, and bad fire on the right there, burning up the canopy. And you know the story. On the left, the good fire historically burned the understory, cleaned out the trash in the understory, and you're left with a nice forest there on the left. On the right here, this is a current problem we have. We've had too much fire suppression, we've got climate change, we have all kinds of human-based problems. The forest is now out of whack. So when a fire comes, it burns really severely there, you see the severe fire, and then you're left with death and destruction. Well, I'm here to tell you, they're wrong. The story's really misleading. Most western conifer forests have always harbored mixed to high severity fire. And by most, I mean 85%, according to Land Fire Database. You can go on, log on, look yourself for fire regimes. 85% of the West is supported by a high severity fire regime. Only 15%, and that would be mostly Arizona and New Mexico, is a low severity understory burn. Don't walk outside here and tell me this is an understory open grown forest regime. It's not. And 85% of the forest, that's the same. Now this is interesting because look at underneath. On the right, if the forests were historically born of low severity fire, they maintain themselves in a steady state. So you're always left with a nice, mature looking forest, which is what everyone loves. On the left, oh my gosh, if it's severe fire, you get something very different. You get what in ecology is called disturbance. You get succession. And succession means you're going to get a series of different stages of forest growth that support very different plants and animals. And if you're interested in maintaining the diversity of life on Earth, you want to maintain all of those stages of succession. So let me just talk about the earliest stage. I don't have time to go into all the different stages and the magic. I'm going to talk about the magic of the very earliest stage. Here's a forest that was burned severely, and in there there's smells you can't smell anywhere else. There's sounds you can't hear anywhere else. There's plants and animals you can't see anywhere else. Mass flowering is the norm in these sorts of forests. And some species, like the black-backed woodpecker, this adorns the cover of a book I just wrote. This bird occurs almost exclusively in severely burned forests. Now, you don't evolve a behavior to be restricted in your habitat use if you haven't been in association with that particular habitat for years. And I don't mean 100 years. I don't mean hundreds of years like tree ring records show. I don't mean thousands of years like the lake core show. I'm talking about many, many, many thousands of years. And this black-backed woodpecker has also evolved a preference, not only that preference for severely burned forests, but geez, look at it. It's back there, it's black against the black tree. That to me is just as impressive as looking at that ptarmigan in snow. Nobody doubts that ptarmigan didn't evolve that coloration over many, many thousands of years. And the same story goes with that woodpecker. We're talking about a vegetation type, a habitat type that's so important that we have to maintain it if we meet our legal mandate to maintain these systems that sustain us all. So the National Forest Management Act, for example, says, yeah, you can have some multiple use, but only if and only if you don't compromise the integrity of the system that sustains us. So that's the law. Let's look at some other things. I mean, my God, there's these beetles. They come in to lay their eggs on these trees. That's why the woodpeckers come in there. I mean, they have a long evolutionary history too. Look at this. This jewel beetle has infrared sensor on its thorax can detect heat for up to 50 miles away. I mean, the things that these organisms have in relation to severely burned forests is amazing. What about morel mushroom? You like those morel mushrooms in your salad? It's in severely burned forest. On the right's a graph by Andrew Larson when they were working in the rimfire out of Yosemite, showing, the only place these things occur is in the more severely burned patch within the severely burned forest. So here's another cool fact, is most of the things that, like the trees in these severely burned forests, need pretty large densities, hundreds of trees per acre. That's important, because if you thin a forest and then it burns severely, and it will, because severe fires are dictated by weather, not fuels. And so when they burn, then you go in here and do surveys, and we've done a lot of surveys, all those magic species aren't there. So you're compromising the integrity of the system if you start messing with it even before the fire. So my story here is intact. Mixed conifer forests are transformed by fire. They're magic. We need to maintain them. So we have to think as managers about succession. And I don't like to think of succession as a line with a beginning and end point, because the end point looks like the end all be all. No, it's a circle. So here's succession. Here's the way it ought to be in the textbooks. And on the left there, you see we have our severe fire. So some older forest, mature old forest gets disturbed. Then you get blackened standing dead trees, and then broken top standing dead trees, and then snags in the middle of shrubs. And every one of these stages has magic species associated with them. So the blackback woodpecker there on the left, and the morel mushroom, and then you can get on to white-breasted nuthatches and Lewis's woodpecker and Williamson sapsucker. If you go a little farther, you can go over. I'll go a little farther, and you're going to get lynx and marten and all kinds of stuff. Okay. Well, you might be saying, "Oh, come on! I can go in there and spit in the forest, it'll get disturbed, and I'll get all the succession." And I'll say, "No, you're wrong. Any other kind of succession, any other kind of disturbance." Clear cutting, salvage logging, or not salvage, but that'd be after the fact. Clear cutting, burning, beetle kill, blowdown, you name it. It takes a different path that's inside this outer path. And so the only way to maintain the diversity that characterizes severely burned forest conditions and all the other stages as we go on in the successional pathway is to keep it all on the landscape. Maintaining the ecological integrity of disturbance-dependent systems requires intact forests and periodic high-severity fire. It's going to happen no matter what. The fire's going to happen. Whether we have intact forests is the question. Management, then, is required at a landscape scale, which in turn requires a lot of land in minimally disturbed conditions. Remember, if you disturb the condition, then it burns, don't get the magic. So we need all stages of natural succession to persist through time. So what's happening in our world, is something like this, right? I mean, this is real satellite imagery, in eastern or western Oregon. I mean, we're losing a lot of this relatively undisturbed land that supports all of the varieties of successional stages. We have to be thinking more along the lines of a kaleidoscope as a manager, and make sure that we have all the stages of succession everywhere. You need 0 to 10-year-old over here. You need 10 to 20 over here. You need 20 to 40-year-old over here. You need another 0 to 10. You need lightning strike and get a new 0 to 10. You have to think about a big kaleidoscope going on here. Something like this. I couldn't do it. I just played it forward and backward to make it seem like. So that's what the world really should be looking like. And managers should be making sure they have all the ages everywhere. And that means uncut before, uncut after for sure. You can't salvage log and get anything remotely resembling a good earth. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm the last presenter, so I know people are eager for me to be done. But for those that are not familiar, WildEarth Guardians has a mission to protect and restore wild places, wild rivers, wildlife, and the health of the American West. And I'm going to give a short overview of the proposal to remove the 2001 Roadless Area Conservation Rule, the government's reasons for doing so, and why we actually need stronger roadless protections. And then I'll wrap up with next steps. So getting underway, across the country, there are now 58.2 million acres of inventory roadless areas where logging and building or reconstructing roads are generally prohibited, though there are several exceptions. And the Forest Service proposal to rescind the 2001 roadless rule affects nearly 45 million of these acres because it excludes Colorado and Idaho, and that's because they have their own state-specific rules. So we're talking about the 2001 rule that is outside of those two states. And when the government proposed repealing the rule, it provided just 21 days for the public to engage, and that is a shockingly short amount of time. Just think, when the rule was first proposed in 1999, the Forest Service provided 60 days for public comments and held 187 public meetings, and that was just the first round. And this time around, they've held 0 meetings. And that's why you're seeing other organizations host these kinds of events, because the public wants to be engaged and they're being locked out. So even with such anemic public engagement opportunities, there were over 620,000 public comments, most, 99%, in support of keeping roadless protections in place. And clearly, the roadless rule is popular. It enjoys widespread support across the country. When the government released its proposal to rescind the rule, it listed several reasons, including to provide more local control, to increase timber production. At least they're being honest. And this was following the Trump executive order titled Immediate Expansion of American Timber Production. And then finally, it was to reduce wildfire risk. And this is the catch-all rationale we see for many forest protection rollbacks. So to be absolutely clear, each one of these rationales is wholly without merit. One of the original purposes of the roadless rule was to provide management consistency across all national forests. In fact, the Forest Service said leaving management decisions to local officials would result in, I quote, substantial loss of quality and quantity of roadless area values and characteristics over time. And that is what we're in store for, should we lose the roadless rule. So looking at increasing timber production, and this is really what the rescission is all about, but building roads to remote areas to timber that in many places has low commercial value makes logging too costly. It simply is not going to pencil out. In fact, the Forest Service often identifies roadless areas as being unsuitable for timber production, and that isn't because of the rule. That's because the timber actually has low value, is too costly to access, and because these areas often provide other values, important values like wildlife habitat, and they're often located on soils that aren't going to support the kind of logging activities that they want to perpetuate. So finally, removing the roadless protections will do nothing to address the underlying causes of increased wildfire risks, namely climate change, past and current fire suppression, exclusion of tribal burning practices, and expanding developments into forested ecosystems. In fact, many counties don't have zoning rules that protect homeowners from wildfires. There's no requirements to home harden. There's no programs in place to help homeowners actually harden their homes and treat the ignition zone, which is where you actually get home protection. So, research shows that burn severity tends to be actually lower in areas that are intact and less intensely managed. But to be clear, we need high severity fires in mixed conifer forests, just as Dr. Hutto explained. But if the goal is to reduce wildfire risk, then the best available science is unequivocal. People caused wildfires. That is the primary reason we have wildfires that are the most damaging, because they're the closest to where people are living. In fact, one study showed human-ignited wildfires represent 84% of all forest fires, and another study puts that number even higher. And across all national forest lands, the Forest Service at least thinks it has 368,000 miles of roads, and those are official roads. They're not the zombie roads that they keep discovering after they put them to bed, and then another land manager comes back and says, oh, here's a road, let's use it again. There's thousands of miles of those roads. And in fact, on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, since 2009, there has been 690 miles of new user-created roads or temporary roads that they didn't get rid of. So we see a proliferation of these unofficial, they call them undetermined roads. So there's a sprawling network of vectors for human ignitions out there. So if you really want to reduce wildfire risk, get rid of the roads, because more roads equals more fires. You know, clearly the reasons for removing protections are flawed, and it's worth noting that the rule already has a number of exemptions that allow the Forest Service to cut trees within roadless areas. These are supposed to be generally small diameter, and cutting is meant to be infrequent. But we see a steady trend across several administrations where the agency is using these exemptions to allow timber production in areas that are unsuitable, often citing wildfire risk. And one example is in the Bitterroot Front project, just on the west side of the Bitterroot Valley, where the Forest Service identified commercial logging units within the Selway-Bitterroot roadless area, including old growth stands, like the one pictured here, that provide important wildlife habitat. Again, the agency uses wildfire risk to commercially log areas that are unsuitable. And it's important to note that many roadless areas actually have some roads. They can be used if they've had ongoing maintenance. But many of these roads have been long abandoned, they're completely revegetated, but we've seen the agency propose to reconstruct these roads, saying, well, we're just going to maintain them, and they haven't been used in 20, 30 years. Clearly, we need to close these loopholes. We need to increase roadless protections. So just to wrap it up, we expected that there would be a draft environmental impact statement. We heard it was coming in March. Then we heard it was coming in April. Then we heard it was just coming last week. So the Forest Service is obviously hearing very clearly that this is an important issue. And sadly, we expect it to actually come out soon, and I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't come out over the Memorial weekend. We're gonna send an alert to everybody who's signed in today. So when the comment period begins, we'll send notification, provide toolkits, help people engage, submit their own comments. Hopefully we'll have time to host maybe a comment party like the good old days with, you know, beer and pizza and whatnot. But if they only provide us 21 days, it'll be a little rush. So I just want to appreciate everybody coming out here tonight. I know it's a beautiful Missoula day, and everyone's time is valuable. So again, thank you all.
If trees went to Congress and forests could vote, our chances of survival might not be so remote. But since we don't give a damn as to who they'd elect, their absentee ballots are the greenhouse effect. What's a boatload of timber? What's the whole human race? I'll ask you, how are you? You stare into space. What's left of the West, where we've already been? So Alaska.